During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, significant technological advancements took place. Many of these were reflected in the military sphere, with the emergence of new weapons and vehicles that would become the precursors to tools used today. In this context, World War I served as a brutal and bloody testing ground, where many of these discoveries were put into action for the first time. One of them was the Winchester Model 1897 shotgun. Featuring a plethora of improvements and innovations compared to previous versions, it became one of the most effective resources used by Americans in the trenches of Europe. So much so that the Germans attempted to prohibit its use. Today in this new military history video, we'll tell you all about the Winchester M97, also known as the trench sweeper. As its name suggests, this shotgun began production in 1897 by the American company Winchester Repeating Arms Company. It was designed by John Browning, one of the most successful firearms inventors in history, having to his credit pistols like the Colt M1911 and machine guns like the M2, among many others. Several of these, including the Winchester 1897, yielded such good results that they continued to be used in conflicts decades after their creation. The shotgun we're discussing today was an improvement over the 1893 model. Some of the advantages this version had over its predecessor included, for example, having a stronger and longer frame. This allowed it to withstand the discharge of 12-gauge white powder cartridges, which had recently entered production at that time. Nevertheless, it could also use larger calibers, such as 16-gauge. The shell ejection was on the side of the weapon, reducing the risks of these larger cartridges jamming the shotgun upon exit. The stock was elongated to provide more stability. Finally, a safety was installed on the slide, preventing accidental discharges and further reducing the risk of the weapon jamming. But there was one particular feature that gave it an advantage over other models and made it continue to be used for years. Its external hammer, which provides the ignition for the shot, lacked a disconnector. This meant that it was not necessary to release the trigger for the projectile to be expelled. It was enough to just pump the gun. This technique was known as slam fire, and below we can see the incredible speeds that a skilled shooter could achieve. The Winchester M97 was not the first pump-action shotgun, but all the advantages it presented over its competitors made it by far the most successful. It quickly became common in civilian activities, such as hunting and sport shooting. However, its leap to fame would occur in another context. In 1899, only 2 years after its introduction to the market, it began to be used in military conflicts. This happened during the Philippine-American War, which erupted in the Asian country. After the Americans defeated Spain a year earlier in a brief confrontation, all their remaining colonies fell into Uncle Sam's hands. This initially did not include the Philippines, as they had declared their independence from the Spaniards during the conflict. But the victor turned a deaf ear and annexed the territory despite vigorous local protests. During the 3 years that the war officially lasted, the battles that ensued were brutal. It is estimated that hundreds of thousands of Filipinos, both civilians and fighters, died. Armed rebellions by guerrilla groups continued for nearly 10 years after the surrender of the Asians, mainly led by local Moro peoples. These fierce fighters were known for their close combat skills, where they used weapons such as knives or swords. In particular, the Americans feared the juramentados, as they called the suicide soldiers who attacked without any hope of survival. It was for this reason that the introduction of the Winchester M97 became so important for American troops. Hundreds of them were sent to the Philippines, where they quickly became the invaders' trump card. Not only were they devastating at short distances, but the brutal effect they had on their victims attacked the morale of the defenders. They witnessed how the bodies of their comrades were torn apart by projectiles fired at rapid speed. Thanks in part to this shotgun, the Americans gained complete control of the archipelago in 1913. With its combat-proven effectiveness, the M97 became a recurring part of the American arsenal. Another occasion it was used was during the expedition in the border war between the United States and Mexico, which began in 1910. During this conflict, which occurred in the context of the Mexican Revolution, Uncle Sam's troops faced off against fighters of Pancho Villa. Here, they once again armed themselves with the infallible shotgun to fight against their southern neighbors. But there was a particular event that sparked the popularity of this weapon, as well as the controversies surrounding its use. In 1914, the First World War began, or the Great War as it was known at the time. The trigger for what would be the largest and bloodiest conflict to date began with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The crime was carried out by the Bosnian Gavrilo Princip, who resented the Austrian occupation of the Balkan countries. The imperialists quickly blamed the Serbian government, with which there were strong tensions, for aiding the terrorist and his organization, without any verifiable evidence that this was the case. The Serbians denied all responsibility, and in response, Austria-Hungary sent them a severe ultimatum. Among other things, they demanded the elimination of organizations calling for the union of the Balkan countries and the participation of imperial officials in the investigation of the assassination. Although most of the points were accepted, some conditions were imposed. This did not satisfy the Austrians, who declared war a few days later. This activated the military treaties signed at the beginning of the 20th century. Serbia was an ally of the countries that made up the Triple Entente: Russia, France, and the United Kingdom. When they joined the conflict, they also led to the mobilization of the so-called Central Powers, namely Germany, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria, who would fight in favor of Austria-Hungary. Many other countries joined the war during the 4 years it lasted, such as Italy, Japan, and the United States. It was the first time the world had seen a conflict of this magnitude. Combat fronts opened in many regions, such as the Middle East, Africa, the Pacific, and the Mediterranean. But undoubtedly, it was in Europe where the most brutal and well-known battles of the First World War took place. At the beginning of it, Germany made good progress towards its Western enemies, managing to defeat Belgium and penetrate much of French territory. But here, their invasion was halted by countries of the Triple Entente, who were now known as the Allies. After some offensives and counteroffensives, both sides became exhausted and had to resort to trench warfare, with the idea of gathering forces to mount a decisive attack. But this type of combat would mark the entire conflict and would extend throughout much of it. Next, we will hear an explanation of what this novel method of warfare consisted of.
Initially, trenches were seen as a temporary measure, one which armies would move on from soon enough. These early trenches were more like ditches, the kind you'd see at the side of a road today. But over the course of the war, they developed into more complex systems.
And you end up with a fire trench, which is your frontline trench, then a support trench, and then behind that a reserve trench. You've got 3 lines connected by what's called communication trenches, so that men and material and supplies can move up and down between the trench lines without having to go over open ground.
Despite the terrible battles that took place among the belligerents, resulting in hundreds of thousands of deaths, the front line barely moved a few kilometers. New weapons were needed that could provide the push sought to prevail. The need to break out of this stalemate, combined with the significant technological advances that had begun at the turn of the century, marked the introduction of many military innovations. Airplanes and tanks, the vehicles that would define martial doctrines of future conflicts, were used for the first time during the Great War. Submarines, heavy artillery, and machine guns, although they had seen combat before, had never been deployed to such a level as in these years. Other darker types of weaponry, such as chemical weapons and flamethrowers, also had their baptism of fire here. In turn, there was innovation in personal armament, such as hand grenades and automatic submachine guns. This is where the central theme of this video comes back into play, the Winchester Model 1897. When the United States entered the war on the side of the Allies in 1917, it brought with it its battlefield-tested weapon designs. After witnessing the development of combat for 3 years, they had taken note of how brutal the fighting in the trenches was. They knew they needed something to give them an advantage. That's why they turned to the Winchester Model 97, not without making some modifications first. A steel plate was added to prevent the soldier from getting burned if the barrel overheated. A bayonet lug was also added, indispensable in the frequent hand-to-hand combat situations. The incredible power of this weapon was quickly demonstrated in the battles fought by the Americans. During the well-known charges that occurred between the positions of the combatants, the men armed with shotguns, if they survived the machine gun and artillery fire, invaded enemy trenches. It was there that these bloody personal struggles took place, with little room to maneuver and the need for quick actions. Having a weapon capable of quickly emptying the magazine, resistant to jams and, above all, devastatingly powerful, was vital for the Allies. Such was its effectiveness that the Winchester M97 was baptized as the trench sweeper. This and other technological advances used by this side were some of the reasons for the rapid collapse of the Central Powers from 1918 onwards. Not only was it used to take out enemy positions, some skilled soldiers were placed in advantageous positions, armed with these shotguns. Their mission was to shoot at enemy grenades while they were in the air, causing them to explode before reaching their target, or at least diverting them from Allied soldiers. This technique is known as shooting on the fly, and it is not only a combat strategy, but also an Olympic sport, although in this case, clay targets are usually used instead of explosives. The Winchester M97 proved so devastating that the Germans protested its use, saying that according to the laws of war, it should not be used. This may sound strange, but it should be remembered that this conflict, unlike others that would occur in the future, was still seen under a code of honor and chivalry, at least at the outset. The belligerents were supposed to follow certain stipulated rules, or else they were considered unworthy. We can hear below the mentality and outdated tactics that were held at the beginning of this conflict.
Audacity, audacity, always audacity was the French credo. Their horses were ready.
All the powers, England, France, Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, held these great reserves of cavalry equipped with swords and lances, ready for the ride through to victory.
This was mostly assumed by officers further away from the front lines, while the rank-and-file soldiers had to face the bloody reality of what modern warfare was. However, the German Empire relied on what was stated in the 1907 Hague Conference, where the doctrine of future armed conflicts had been stipulated. One of its points said, "The employment of arms, projectiles, or materials specifically intended to cause unnecessary suffering is especially prohibited." For the Germans, the Winchester M97 did not comply with what was established here. The power of this weapon resulted in, even if a soldier had the fortune to survive one of its shots, the pellets often caused terrible wounds. Losing a limb due to a single projectile was common. Additionally, these injuries were exacerbated by the epidemics that plagued the battlefront. The trenches had poor hygiene conditions, so diseases spread incredibly easily. This, coupled with the scarcity of medical supplies by 1917, meant that shotgun-wounded soldiers often ended up being counted among the fatalities. These arguments were not sufficient for the judges of the U.S. Army, who dismissed the German protests. They did not see the weapon as violating any laws of war. Furthermore, they argued, if the Winchester was considered to cause unnecessary suffering, the same should apply to flamethrowers or serrated bayonets used by the Germans. This without even mentioning chemical weapons, which were indeed prohibited under the Hague Agreements, but were still used by both sides.
Eine Granate, die explodiert, die sieht man und hört man. Und wenn man den Kopf in den Graben nimmt, dann hat man auch einen gewissen Schutz und dann ist die Wirkung vorbei. Aber Gas ist eben unheimlich, weil es still ist und weil es dauerhaft wirken kann. Also selbst wenn Sie aus dem Graben herauskommen als Soldat, müssen Sie befürchten, dass Gas in den Trichtern noch vorhanden ist. Was viele Menschen beeindruckt hat, ist natürlich die Vorstellung, dass hier ein industrieller Massenmord stattfindet.
Faced with the refusal of the Allies, the Central Powers declared that any prisoner of war found in possession of this shotgun would be punished. Responding to this threat, the Americans said the same fate would befall the Germans who used the aforementioned weapons as counterexamples. Still, despite these hostile comments, there are no records of any captured soldiers suffering abuse for these reasons. Moreover, there is very little audio-visual material documenting the use of the Winchester M97 on the battlefield. According to some historians, the United States subtly ordered troops to stop being armed with the lethal shotgun. The reason was that they did not want to give the enemy press reasons to portray their forces as barbaric and incapable of using proper weapons. They also sought to prevent their military allies, France and the United Kingdom, from using this argument to exert control over the American army. They viewed this country as a junior member within the alliance and could use any reason to limit its sovereignty in wartime decisions. Other sources claim that in reality, the Winchester continued to be used on the front lines, but any photo or video of it was censored before reaching the general public. World War I ended on November 11, 1918, with the armistice of the only Central Power still standing, Germany. But this did not mean the end of the use of the Winchester M97. After the conflict, it began to be used by some sectors of the security forces in the United States. It could be seen in police officers or bank guards like American Express. It was thought of as a riot control weapon, using its pre-war version without the bayonet. The shotgun's effectiveness was such that, despite the existence of much newer designs in the following decades, it continued to be used for large-scale military conflicts. Many American Marines turned to this model during World War II. Even decades later, during combat in Korea and Vietnam, this weapon was also chosen when close-quarters fighting was deemed likely. Thanks to its power and reliability, governments like China and Germany copied its design or bought the American version massively. This was not surprising, as some of these countries had witnessed the formidable power of the Winchester. We've reached the end of the video and we want to ask you, do you think the use of certain firearms should be prohibited during war? Don't leave without leaving your answer in the comments section. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that have left their mark on history.